Culturally, Americans view themselves as a proud and brave people. Yet there seems to be much evidence that Americans are, in fact, very fearful. The American responses to crises, both real and perceived, have caused some irrational behaviors. Some of these actions may seem justified, others amusing.
Call now and get the ultimate Y2K survival kit.
But Americans also have a history of responding in rather sinister ways.
And complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States,
hiding their own fears behind the government's policies of discrimination and prejudice. One of the most infamous of these typically American responses is that of Japanese internment. While taught in schools, it is often little more than a footnote. It is, after all, not America's proudest moment. And as a people who only want to feel pride, it does not fit the narrative that America is the guiding light of democracy. Though this event occurred more than 80 years ago, it still has ramifications to this day and is worth revisiting. The latter half of the 19th century and early 20th century saw a large influx of immigrants to the United States. These were a people escaping persecution, economic hardships, famine, and war. As a proud nation of immigrants, these people were welcomed. Sometimes. The brave Americans, who at one point were likely immigrants themselves, were leery of these new immigrants. When World War I broke out, many Germans changed their names in hopes of assimilating and avoiding discrimination. White Germans with an opportunity to become U.S. citizens typically didn't have much difficulty in blending in with white America. For others, this process was not as simple. Going back to this brave and proud nation's birth, immigration was always a topic of debate. Citizenship needed to be granted to a large number of people so that the new country could have, citizens. Enter the Naturalization Act of 1790. It granted citizenship to free white Americans who resided in the United States for at least 2 years, later becoming 5 years. It notably did not extend to non-whites, namely African slaves in the South and freed blacks in the North, who accounted for about 20% of the U.S. population at the time. The issue of slavery eventually led to a civil war, though even this cause has been whitewashed into an issue of states' rights. States' rights to own slaves, to be perfectly clear. After the Confederacy's defeat, the Naturalization Act of 1790 was updated to include people of African descent. And that brings us back to the influx of immigration around the turn of the 20th century. While that time period saw large numbers of people emigrating from Southern and Eastern Europe, it also witnessed a sizable number of Japanese.
As Chinese and Japanese crossed the Pacific in considerable numbers, they from the Orient settled chiefly in our far west.
Not fitting into the box of white or African, the first-generation Japanese immigrants, known as the Issei, were unable to obtain citizenship or own property in their new country. This didn't stop them from prospering through leasing agricultural land or acquiring other work. But then this happened.
Here is the motion picture record released by the United States Navy of the havoc wrought by the Japs' sneak sky and sea raid on Pearl Harbor. Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes.
Anti-Japanese sentiment was clearly not a new thing, but looking like one of America's enemies did not do them any favors. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasted no time in using the Alien Enemies Act and signing Executive Order 9066, declaring the western states a military zone and effectively declaring that all Japanese people living on the West Coast were likely saboteurs and spies. This view was shared by most Americans at the time.
We could only wait for the day when this undercover war resulted in the open declaration of hostilities.
And the Japanese faced widespread discrimination, often resulting in physical attacks. Simple-minded Americans began treating all Asians with contempt, unable to discern Japanese people from those from other Asians, such as the Chinese, an American ally at the time. Within a few months of Pearl Harbor, every Japanese person on the West Coast was rounded up, forced to give up any of their possessions along with their civil rights, and forcibly relocated to various concentration camps located across the country. These sites, ranging from California to Arkansas, were far away from anything of interest, and often located in rather inhospitable environments.
They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration.
While it is true that the Issei, or first generation, could not become citizens, the Naturalization Acts allowed for birthright citizenship, so the second generation, known as the Nisei, and onward were full-fledged American citizens. This meant that the majority of people who were rounded up and put in camps were actually American citizens. While all of this was happening, the general consensus amongst the American public was that these actions were justified. The United States was at war with Japan, and it seemed a reasonable response to put every person with Japanese background behind a barbed wire fence to make sure that they didn't try anything sneaky. All shortwave radios were confiscated, lest they try and communicate with the Japanese Imperial fleet. Of course, the United States wasn't just at war with Japan. The Axis powers included Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy over in Europe. While an extremely small percentage of Germans or Italians were rounded up by the FBI, most of these had proven links to Nazism or fascist causes. In all, over 120,000 people of Japanese background were placed in 10 concentration camps around the country.
Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live.
In an era that seemed to ostensibly coin the term concentration camp, it is important to note what actually happened behind the wire. Nazi concentration camps were built to fulfill different objectives. Slave labor, medical experimentation, and racial extermination were a few of their sinister goals. The American concentration camps were not the same. They were created out of fear that anyone of Japanese background would be loyal to the emperor and willingly commit espionage against the United States. Therefore, the only solution was to contain all of these people in an area where they could be observed and controlled. The living conditions were basic. Sometimes different families or couples had to share the same barracks, using makeshift privacy dividers. Toilets were separate in a communal latrine. Food was served from a mess hall with volunteer chefs. There was very little in the form of creature comforts. People made do by trying to make it as much as home as humanly possible. These camps effectively became towns, with schools, social clubs, and even farms to grow crops throughout the year. As for attitudes within the camps, these varied. The Issei in particular often lived by the now infamous phrase of shikataganai, or it cannot be helped. While not a literal translation, it is more of a cultural philosophy of accepting what cannot be changed. The younger generations, however, felt more conflicted about their impromptu incarceration. The Nisei, the second generation, were often eager to prove their loyalty to the United States, but this was complicated by the fact that the United States had also put them behind barbed wire. In 1943, a loyalty questionnaire was distributed to all internees to supposedly root out the disloyal. It asked whether or not they would be willing to serve in the armed forces and if they could swear an unqualified allegiance to the United States. Given the complicated circumstances they found themselves in, there was much debate on how to answer this. Disregarding the fact that no self-respecting spy or saboteur would ever truthfully admit to being disloyal, answering was not as clear-cut. On one hand, how can you respect and pledge your allegiance to a country that treated you as a pariah? How can you be expected to die for a country that is keeping the rest of your family in a camp? For these reasons, some answered no on the loyalty questionnaire. These people were deemed disloyal and sent to the Tule Lake Camp in Northern California, a camp with a much bleaker outlook for internees. They were given the option to renounce their American citizenship and be repatriated to Japan, despite many not having ever actually set foot there. Many took this option, thinking it couldn't be any worse than their current conditions. Yet, surprisingly, for every supposedly disloyal person in the camps, there were countless Nisei eager to prove their loyalty to the country that had shunned them. By early 1944, Japanese Americans were eligible again for the draft, and many jumped at the chance. Being a segregationist country, the Japanese Americans were not allowed to fight within white units, for example. Thus, the 442nd Combat Regiment was formed, an all-Nisei fighting force. They went on to become the most decorated American unit of World War II, proving that they lived up to the go for broke motto they adopted and would stop at nothing to complete their objectives at any cost. It also became known as the Purple Heart Unit, due to such large numbers of casualties sustained during fighting in the European theater. And sure enough, as more time went by, government attitudes about the camps slowly shifted. To be sure, this was far from any kind of apology. In fact, the U.S. government doubled down on its justification for forcibly removing all the Japanese Americans from the West Coast and putting them in camps.
We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
There was even a Supreme Court case that ruled that the executive order was justified. But mostly due to wartime labor shortages, restrictions were slowly relaxed. Many were allowed to work outside the camps to make a living. Others were allowed to leave entirely if they could find a white sponsor that would vouch for them if they relocated somewhere else away from the West Coast. Slowly, the population of the camps decreased as entire families tried to start anew in the Midwest or out east. Yet it was no mass exodus from the camps either. People simply didn't know what their options were. those who had made their entire lives on the West Coast were hesitant to start all over again. They held out, hoping they could someday move back home, while also fearful of reprisals and discriminatory attacks. By 1945, fewer and fewer people remained in the camps, but those that did felt they were out of options. Removed from the one home they had, these primitive camps were all they had left. The government offered them transportation to other places in the United States, but offered no assistance beyond that, and perhaps even more importantly, no apology. And as the war officially came to a close, the camps too officially closed. Few of those interned there wanted to talk about it, and hoped instead to go on with their lives without further antagonism. And it went on like this for decades. In 1952, Japanese and people of other non-white backgrounds could finally become U.S. citizens. Executive Order 9066 was technically still on the table until 1976, when President Ford finally terminated it officially. And it wasn't until 1988, more than 45 years after FDR signed Executive Order 9066, that President Reagan offered an official apology for the injustice of what happened.
For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
Surviving internees were given reparations as a way of trying to right the wrong, along with a rare formal admission of having made a grave mistake.
Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor.
For most Americans, that's where the story ends. For an event that happened over 80 years ago, it has a frightening relevance to this day. This is what remains of Manzanar Relocation Center, former site of one of the largest concentration camps for Japanese Americans. Relocation Center is already a bit of a euphemism in its own right, but the National Park Service is now required to post these signs, asking visitors to comment on anything that doesn't portray the United States in a glowing light. Executive Order 14253, signed by President Trump in March of 2025, aims to remove any potentially divisive depictions of the history of the United States. Trump's order, written to restore truth and sanity in American history, accomplishes neither of those tasks. Instead, it promotes an ideology that encourages a total rewriting of history, ignorant of facts, and is recklessly irresponsible. Like any country, the United States has its share of ups and downs. Acknowledging the negative aspects of American history doesn't make its citizenry any less patriotic. In fact, learning about these errors would have helped us from making the same mistakes over and over and over again. The U.S. government under Trump is currently in a massive push to detain and deport illegal immigrants, stating that they are dangerous criminals. But in practice, that's not really what's happening, with American citizens often getting caught up in ICE's discriminatory tactics. ICE itself has admitted that hearing Spanish is enough cause for arrest, and has come under fire for a lack of due process and ignorance of civil liberties in its actions. Some of those arrested are being deported to a prison in El Salvador, others to countries they've never actually lived in, and there are even plans for new concentration camps within the United States.
It's been a fantastic week at DHS, so let's get into it. This week, Secretary Noem joined President Donald J. Trump for the opening of a new detention facility in Florida, known as Alligator Alcatraz. Located in the Florida Everglades, Alligator Alcatraz is the perfect location to house the worst of the worst criminal illegal aliens. Isolated and surrounded by dangerous wildlife and unforgiving terrain, there is only one road leading in.
Though a barrage of legal challenges to these camps is ongoing, those in power, and a large swath of our citizenry, remain unnervingly proud of them. If we've learned anything from this, it is perhaps that presidential executive orders are maybe a bad idea in general. While sometimes they cut through the red tape, they seem to have some very far-reaching negative consequences when they put too much power in the hands of one person. Secondly, there's the old cliché that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. ICE's actions and Japanese internment, for example, do of course have their differences, but they are both a miscarriage of justice on strictly racial lines. It is worth remembering that for the 120,000 people of Japanese descent who were incarcerated in the 1940s, not a single one was charged with espionage or any subversive activities. Their only crime was looking Japanese. Fast forward to today, and advocates for ICE's arrest would say that this is ridding the streets of violent criminals, but at the same time arresting day laborers and workers with no criminal history. They would argue that they should have come into this country the right way, but arrest them and their immigration lawyers at their visa renewals or at a court.
DHS would be conducting enforcement at the courts.
American citizens are being arrested or harassed for merely looking Hispanic. It bears the markings of a tired trend in American history. It took more than 45 years after FDR's executive order to get an official apology from the American government for its error. In this current political climate and its America First rhetoric, we are unlikely to hear a similar apology anytime soon.
Leave now.
We cannot continue to pretend to be the land of the free if that freedom is selectively distributed. And as long as we continue to be duped by leaders or the media into hysterics and fearing a group of people who simply aspire to the same American dream as us, we're not very brave either.
Only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish,
Well, those days are over.
and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good.
The deportations won't just continue, they will skyrocket.
Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told.
The work to secure our borders, defend our values, and rebuild our nation is just getting started.
In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalty to an enemy nation.
Alligator Alcatraz is the exact kind of solution that happens when we work together and put the American people first.
The full story will begin to unfold when the
Victories to reclaim our nation's strength and reverse the social, moral, economic, and cultural decay
of sabotage and espionage,
Under President Trump, DHS has returned to its core mission.
protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. We hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.
See you next week.